My mom and I used to hike together every summer. We started when I was just a little kid, with easy park trails that I could toddle down. Then, when I was old enough, we moved up to tougher and tougher trails. It was a good way to stay active and a great way to bond. During the winters, we'd sit in her kitchen drinking hot tea and looking up interesting new trails to explore. Living in Alberta, there's really no shortage of them. We'd spent a lot of time out in or around Banff. We'd even done some weekend trips that way. If you've never been, Banff is beautiful. The waters run a surreal teal color. The rolling mountains dominate the land. And everywhere you look, there's another scenic view just waiting to be discovered. The little town of Banff itself is nice too. It's quaint and charming. A few times, Mom and I talked about trying to conquer the Centennial Pass Trail, although we never actually got around to doing it. She had done it once, before I was born, and had always talked about doing it again with me. Centennial Pass is one of the toughest trails Banff has to offer. You're spending most of your time going uphill. The terrain is rocky, and in some places the trail is fairly narrow. It's 17 kilometers long, and according to Mom, it felt 10 times longer. Although the scenic views were absolutely worth it. Every time Centennial Pass came up, she had to bring up the photos. I think she did it more for her own benefit than mine. Every time she looked at them, she was reminded of a day she wanted to cherish, and got to think about another day she desperately looked forward to. Honestly, I never got tired of listening to her talk about it. The way her eyes would light up as she showed me the pictures she'd taken, while I sat by with big, wide eyes petting Benny, her big, fluffy orange cat. Even after I'd made it to my mid-20s and moved out on my own, the moment she started talking about the pictures she'd taken up at Centennial Pass, I was a little kid again, transfixed by the same old story, and I'd fantasize about the day that we finally decided to tackle it. I imagined looking over those same scenic vistas with my mom, and I wondered if maybe this would be the summer we'd finally do it. Unfortunately, that summer never came. The cancer came on quickly, and it tore her apart like tissue paper. One day, Mom just got sick, and about 2 months later, she was gone. She was the strongest person I knew, and she'd fought as hard as she could. The cancer fought harder. Losing her was the hardest thing I've ever been through, and that pain isn't a pain I'd wish on anyone. I dealt with the grief as best as I could. If nothing else, I wasn't alone in dealing with it, which helped somewhat. I had family and friends to help me, and we relied on each other as best as we could, while we slowly recovered from the pain of our loss. The summer after she passed was the first summer that I hiked alone. I couldn't think of any better trail to go down than Centennial Pass. I arrived at the trail sometime around 10 in the morning, with all the gear I was sure I'd need in my backpack, plus one little extra thing. Mom had asked to be cremated when she died, and her only request was that we scatter her ashes someplace beautiful. Since I was setting out to conquer Centennial Pass, I figured that I should bring her with me. I'd find one of the cliff edges that overlooked a lake about halfway through the trail, and then I'd scatter her ashes there. It was perfect. The first 45 minutes to an hour down the trail were surprisingly easygoing. It was rocky, yes, and a lot of it was uphill, but I was used to that. Past that 45-minute mark, though, things got a little more complicated. The trail took a sharp upward incline, and was just as rocky as before. I had a hiking pole with me to help me keep my balance, but I've got to admit it was still a little challenging. Through it all, I envisioned my mom up near the top of the incline, grinning down at me. "What, tired already?" she would have teased. "Maybe I should have come out here with Benny instead." That thought brought a weary smile to my face as I toughed out the incline. After that, things were a little smoother for a while. I made it to the 2-hour mark following a windy, slightly narrow, but much less rocky dirt trail up to the first scenic vista, looking over the vast forests of Banff. I could see mountains looming in the distance and had to take a moment to pause and enjoy the view. Someone had thoughtfully provided a couple of benches nearby, and I figured I might as well sit down in one. have some water, and enjoy a snack. My muscles ached from all the climbing, although it was a good ache, the kind of ache you get after a solid workout. Mom hadn't lied. This trail was tough. But that view? Oh man, was it ever worth it? After my break, I packed everything up and continued on. The trail didn't head down just yet. It seemed like it was going to loop around the cliff I was on, before dipping into the titular Centennial Pass and up another mountain. That said, the path wasn't quite as smooth as the one up had been. The trail was a little narrower, and dropped off onto a pretty sharp incline. It wasn't a straight drop down, but a bad step could probably end in some pretty serious injuries. The trail stayed narrow for about 45 minutes, and I imagine it would have finally started to dip more noticeably after that, although I never found out for sure what was waiting for me up ahead. Nope. I accidentally took the shortcut. I'd slowed my pace to grab my water and check my phone to see what time it was. I had noticed that the trail had gotten a little rockier, but I didn't think much of it until I stepped on one of them wrong. My boot slipped to the side, and I felt a stab of panic run through me as my body began to fall. I grabbed for the nearest branch, and all it did was bend and break in my hands. I vaguely remember saying something to the effect of, "Shit, shit, shit, oh God," before I finally started falling towards the sharp incline. I hit the ground hard, rolling as gravity did its thing and pulled me down what had to be at least a 50-foot drop. Had it been straight down, I probably would have died. But I got lucky. The incline was pretty sharp, but it had mellowed out a bit. Rolling down it still hurt like a motherfucker, and I was bruised, scratched up, and in a lot of pain by the time I made it to the bottom. But I wasn't dead. And as far as I could tell, I also wasn't that badly hurt. By the time the throbbing pain in my everything stopped and I was able to sit up, I was relieved to find that nothing was broken. I'm not sure if that was pure dumb luck or something else. Although, unfortunately, my luck didn't transfer to my backpack. I'd heard something cracking while I'd been rolling down the incline, and as I lay in the dirt, a bruised, bloody mess, I felt something cold and wet spreading along my back. An inspection of my backpack revealed that my plastic water bottle was broken. Worse still, the travel urn that carried Mom's ashes was also broken, and her earthly remains had mixed into a slurry that now ruined my backpack forever. Honestly, Mom probably would have found this funny, although, at the moment, I didn't really feel like laughing. It felt wrong to get mad at the mess that my mother's ashes had left behind, but I was still upset. The ash-water mix had destroyed my maps. It had gotten mixed in with the trail mix I packed, forcing me to reluctantly dump it out since I decided I really didn't want to eat my mother's ashes. My phone and compass were broken, but I still had my multi-tool and pocket knife. My first aid kit was a little damp, but still intact. This wasn't exactly an ideal situation, but maybe I could make it work. Looking up, I could see the trail above me, and remembered that I'd been heading west before my fall. In theory, if I went far enough east, maybe I could find my way back to a part of the trail I'd already passed. In a worst-case scenario, the Centennial Pass Trail was a loop. Realistically, I could also just go north and probably find my way out of the forest. Hopefully. It took me a little while to start moving again. I'm not exactly sure how long. But when I finally did, the going was slow. I stopped to rest more often than I wanted to. Although, at a few points, my body simply didn't feel like moving. I had considered attempting to scale the incline again, but it was too sharp and too high. I couldn't have made it up. And even if I could, I risked hurting myself even more. So I just went east, until I couldn't shadow the trail anymore. Eventually, the only route available to me was down, so I took that. The sun passed overhead slowly, marking the time as it did. Eventually, the sky started to turn golden, and after hours of making slow progress northeast, I was still out on the mountain. The air was starting to get a little colder. I dressed reasonably warmly and could start a fire if I needed to, but I'd rather not have been out there after dark if I could help it. That said, I wasn't so sure I could help it. As the sky turned darker, I eventually collapsed against a tree to rest. My body ached. Every muscle I had cried out in pain. My throat was parched. I'd eaten the last of my granola bars, and the hunger was starting to set in. I couldn't keep going. Physically, I couldn't do it. I needed to rest. I found a little space where I could safely build a fire and use the last of my energy to set to work. Sleeping out here amongst the bugs and the animals didn't seem like anything remotely resembling a safe idea, but it was the only choice I had. I reasoned that if I could keep the fire going through the night, maybe I could build it up in the morning. If I made it smoky enough, maybe someone would see it and come to investigate. It was the best idea I had going for me. I built the fire and used my backpack as a pillow while I rested. The mosquitoes buzzed in my ear while they ate me alive. I heard the occasional small animal moving through the forest, but as far as I could tell, nothing bigger than a squirrel was out there hunting me. It was just me, alone in the woods. And as I lay huddled next to the fire, resting on a backpack soaked in my mother's ashes, I couldn't stop myself from crying. I felt like I'd ruined everything. All I'd wanted to do was take one last hike with Mom. I wanted to spread her ashes somewhere beautiful, some place that she would have loved. Now here I was, sleeping on the ground and wondering if I was going to make it out of this alive. Mom wouldn't have wanted to see me like this. If Mom were there, she would have hugged me and reassured me. She would have told me that we'd be fine. We'd have rested through the night, and in the morning, we'd send up some smoke and be back in town by lunch. Hell, if Mom were there, she probably would have seen me fall off the trail, then called for help on her phone. I wouldn't be in this mess if Mom were there. But she wasn't. God, I missed her. I missed her more than I could put into words. And every beautiful memory we'd shared now was filtered through a new lens of pain. Half the reason I cried that night was out of grief. I didn't want to die out there. And I didn't want to have to keep going without my mom by my side. I curled myself into a ball, sobbing as the fire burned beside me. And for a few minutes I started to wonder if maybe I wouldn't be happier if I never got up again. And with that thought in my head, I finally drifted away into a dreamless sleep. I woke up early in the morning to the sensation of something soft rubbing against my face, accompanied by a low grumbling noise. No, not grumbling. Purring. I opened my eyes to see nothing but orange fur in my face. I pulled back, a little out of shock, only to see an indignant-looking cat staring at me as if to say, "What the fuck? I was comfy there." I stared at the cat for a few moments. He was a big, fluffy orange boy who looked a lot like Benny, although Benny had been dead for years by that point. What the hell was a cat doing out in the middle of the woods? Stupid question. Cats go wherever the hell they want. The cat turned away from me, swishing his tail nonchalantly as he walked away. My eyes shifted over towards the fire, only to see that it was long dead. The ashes weren't even smoldering anymore. Shit. I slowly sat up, groaning in pain as I did, and inspected the fire. I'd need to make a new one if I wanted to get any smoke. Although, I looked over at the cat again. He'd sauntered over to a fallen tree and jumped up onto it to give himself a bath. Why would a cat be this deep in the woods? He wouldn't. He had to have come from somewhere. Maybe I was closer to civilization than I realized. Maybe he could lead me back to it. He obviously wasn't afraid of me. "Hey," I said, my voice a little hoarse. "Do you have an owner, little guy?" The cat looked up at me. He said nothing because he was a cat, and thus incapable of human speech. But he did show me his asshole, before jumping off the log and stalking through the woods. Fuck it. What did I have to lose at this point? I slowly got up and, with aching muscles, trudged to follow the cat. I watched as he calmly weaved his way through the trees, as if he knew exactly where he was going. He looked back at me occasionally, as if he was checking to make sure I was following, but didn't ever really stop or slow down. I didn't expect to be walking for so long, but as we made our way through the forest, the sun just kept getting higher in the sky. We had to have been going for almost an hour, and I had already considered stopping a few times. You sure you're helping me get back home, little guy? I asked the cat. He just looked back at me, swished his tail, and kept walking. Sometime later, the exhaustion started to set in again. My pace was slowing down. The hunger and the thirst were worse than I'd ever felt them before. I stopped for a moment to rest against a tree, and looked up at the orange shape a few feet ahead of me. "Hey," I called. "Wait up." The cat paused, then looked around before looking at me with wide eyes. For a moment, I half expected him to keep walking, but he didn't. He just stared at me, swishing his tail before turning around and trotting towards me. "Need to catch my breath," I said as the cat drew closer. He rubbed himself against my legs, purring all the while, and I reluctantly reached down to pet him. His head nuzzled into my hand. "Don't suppose you'd know where I could find any water?" I asked hopefully. The cat just looked at me. He clearly did not understand a word I was saying. "How much further do you want me to go?" I asked. "I thought the road would be close by." The cat just swished his tail and purred. A few minutes later, he was walking again. The message was clear. Break time is over. Back to hiking. I forced my battered body to comply. I heard it long before I saw it. The sound of a car passing by on a nearby road. And the moment I realized what was happening, I felt a pang of hope in my chest. The cat was glancing back at me more often now, as if to say, "Hey, we're close. Don't fall behind." And I followed his every footstep. I could see the glimmer of a passing car through the trees as I drew nearer to the road. I was so close. So close. On unstable feet, I stepped out of the tree line and onto the edge of the highway. And I honestly could have collapsed to the ground and kissed the asphalt. I'd never been so happy to see pavement before. I looked back at the cat who stood at the tree line, swishing his tail back and forth. "Thank you," I said hoarsely. The cat just gave me a slow, meaningful blink before turning around and stalking off back into the woods. I managed to flag down a passing SUV shortly after I made it to the road. They took me to the hospital where I got checked out. I had a fractured rib and a lot of bruises, but aside from that, and the dehydration, I was fine. I did ask about the orange cat that I saw, and if he had an owner. But nobody I spoke to knew of anybody with an outdoor orange cat, especially one who'd have been that far in the woods. Turns out I'd missed the trail entirely, and wandered far to the northeast. If I kept going the way that I was going, I would have been lost for a hell of a lot longer. By the time I flagged down that SUV, I was good and lost in the middle of nowhere. Without that cat, chances are I really would have died out there. It's been a few years since I tried to hike Centennial Pass, and I've thought about what happened there a lot. I've heard some people talk about believing that they've seen their loved ones returning as animals. Owls, birds, cats. Something that's still part of their life in some way. Reminding them that those they've lost are still with them. And sometimes, I wonder if the orange cat I saw in the woods was sent by my mother, as a way of bringing me home safely. Despite everything, I do intend to return to Centennial Pass someday. I still want to conquer it, and stand atop the vistas my mother once stood atop. Of course, next time I'll be smart, and I won't go it alone. Maybe when I have my own kids, and they're old enough, then we'll do it together. Just like Mom and I never got to. Become a channel member today for early access, bonus videos, and special emojis only available to members. Check out the description below or click the join button for more info. If you'd like another way to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/Jordan Group Horror. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus videos and content. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward, and if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you which will be featured in a Hollow's End story. Links to join the Patreon are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow. And see you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.